So, yeah, it finally happened. We got a modern Marvel vs. Capcom collection. Capcom's game compilations in the past few years have been interesting for a variety of reasons. They started out by outsourcing development of these compilations to studios like Digital Eclipse, who handled the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection as well as the first Mega Man Legacy Collection. They were decent, but definitely had their share of issues. At some point, though, Capcom decided to start bringing the development of these compilations in-house. The last few Mega Man collections have been phenomenal, and interestingly enough have been full ports instead of just simply emulation. The Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle and the Capcom Fighting Collection are both pretty fantastic for the most part, and are notably handled by longtime programmers at Capcom that have been there since the arcade days. So the fact that it looks like the same group of people are working on this collection is already a fantastic sign. But why exactly is this release such a big deal beyond Marvel 2 being freed? Well, there's a lot to talk about here, so let's take a look at what we do know about these new releases and why it's important. The Marvel vs. Capcom games are arguably the highest profile fighting game series outside of Mortal Kombat to have most of their past entries inaccessible on modern platforms. A big chunk of it comes down to licensing, as most would expect, but even then, the series' history of console ports have been spotty. Most of the CPS2 based Marvel games, with the exception of Marvel Superheroes and Marvel 1, have never had arcade perfect home ports. Children of the Atom has an okayish Saturn port with load times and animation cuts. The PS1 version has that, but worse. And the Oft Forgotten DOS port has all of the animation intact, but broke something in the process that made a lot of combos that were possible in the arcade release unusable. Marvel Superheroes notably had a pretty poor port on both the PS1 and Saturn, with even the optional RAM expansion toggle on Saturn not helping matters much. It restored some animation frames, sure, but at the expense of the game's overall performance. X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter infamously got cut down massively for the PS1 releases, and the Saturn ports, which were notably better and the best of these ports so far, only released in Japan. As decent as the Saturn ports are, they still don't quite match up to the arcade versions, though I think they are worth owning. Marvel 1 has fared somewhat better, getting a Dreamcast port that was great, and was bundled with Marvel Superheroes for MVC Origins, which was also great. But Dreamcast is a 26-year-old console, and Origins was delisted years ago. And I think most people are aware today of Marvel 2's availability and the spotty quality of ports that aren't the Dreamcast version. On top of that, this will be the first time the Punisher arcade game's been available in its original form on consoles as well. It got a Genesis port back in the day, but it doesn't measure up to the original at all. So to have all of these games in one collection in their original forms for the first time, and physically at that, is a huge deal. Of all the Capcom collections released so far, this one already has one of the highest value propositions out there. Tracking down the original console releases of these games are expensive, and getting them in one collection is not only convenient, but actually cost effective for anyone wanting to play these games on their consoles. Most of Capcom's compilations so far have included a suite of extra features, a lot of which are standard fare in compilation releases. You got save states, online play, gallery modes, and music players among other things. One that's actually kind of a big deal is the addition of a training mode for each game. Yeah, if you play on Fightcade, they have one, but let's be real. The vast majority of the target audience for this collection specifically has probably never even heard of Fightcade, and even if they have, they might not want to go through the trouble of setting it up. Children of the Atom has never had a proper training mode in any official release. The training modes for X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter are exclusive to the iffy PS1 ports, and the now delisted MVC Origins is the only release of Marvel Superheroes that had one. So being able to lab these games out at your own leisure, with hitbox data included on top of that, is honestly a godsend. I mean, hey, maybe the Marvel 2 wiki won't be a barren wasteland for anyone that isn't a top tier character now. The Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle and the Capcom Fighting Collection are probably where you should look if you want an idea of what features will be made available here, but the website for the game also lists some changes. Let's go game by game. So this release of Children of the Atom is going to be the first time Magneto and Juggernaut can be enabled without using cheat devices or hacking, which is pretty cool. Technically, both can be enabled in the DOS port I mentioned earlier, but no one plays that version. Juggernaut could also be selected via a glitch in the Japanese Saturn version, but that was unintentional. This is something they've done in previous collections, like making the boss characters and cyberbots freely playable in the Fighting Collection, so it's nice to see that upheld here. Marvel Superheroes is taking a page out of the Origins release and allowing you to play as Doctor Doom, Thanos, and Anita with a toggle, which is nice. I'm glad Anita in particular is being retained. X-Men vs Street Fighter doesn't have much in the way of new things aside from a universal toggle I'll get to in a moment, but I want to draw attention to the ROM revisions being highlighted here. From the beat 'em up bundle onwards, Capcom has allowed you to play both the international and Japan-based ROMs for the games, and this collection is no different, even specifying which ROM revision is being used, which really only means anything to sickos like me. That ROM revision is worth talking about though. It looks like they're using the 961023 ROM, which hardcore X-Men vs Street Fighter heads might know as Revision 3. This version of the game is a bit infamous among old school players for removing a lot of the game's infinites. They weren't all removed, mind you, but most of the big ones that had been discovered around that time were gone. And infinites kind of define X-Men vs Street Fighter more than any other versus game, even Marvel 2 to an extent. So much so that most tier lists for the game generally divide things into a tier list that takes into account infinites and one that doesn't. That said, pretty much everyone in the know about that revision are probably happily playing the game on Fightcade or on cabinets anyway, so this is largely a non-issue for a majority of the target audience, but it's definitely something I felt was worth noting. On to Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, and this is actually the first instance of something being removed, albeit for understandable reasons. It looks as if Norimaru is being removed from the Japanese version of the game, which is fair. He's a guest character that Capcom doesn't own, which already adds a bunch of legal complexities to a series full of them. It's unfortunate, especially since Norimaru had an original moveset, but it's understandable. What is nice though is that Cyber Akuma is going to be made officially playable. He could be unlocked in the console ports of the game, but this will be the first time he'll be freely selectable in an arcade-based version, which is pretty neat. Marvel 1 notably has a note about some stage backgrounds being altered. If I had to guess, I'd say this is more than likely going to involve the E Honda bathhouse stage, particularly the rising sun flag in the background. The flag's been noted in recent years of being a symbol of racial segregation and some of Japan's more murkier involvement with things during World War II, so I get it. Honda's bathhouse also had this change made in recent Street Fighter II re-releases as well, so that's consistent. One thing I'm curious about is the hidden characters. Roland in particular is highlighted on the website, but the others aren't, and that goes for the secret characters in Marvel vs Street Fighter 2. I'm sure they're still there, but I'm wondering if they'll be enabled off the bat instead of having to do button codes this time around, or if you'll just have to remember the codes for them. I guess we'll see on release. Marvel 2 is the most interesting game here to me. It's notably not a CPS2 game, but instead a Naomi game, which historically hasn't received much in the way of official ports or emulation. As far as Capcom stuff goes, I think the only other Naomi-based game outside of Marvel 2 to ever be ported or re-released in any fashion was the Power Stone games, which got re-released for PSP. Technically, CVS2 got released on PS3, but that's just emulation of the PS2 version. Looking at the footage, it's in 4:3 and doesn't appear to be rendering at a higher resolution, so chances are that this is likely emulating the Naomi arcade version, which is interesting. The Dreamcast version is more or less arcade perfect, but notably runs at a slightly different speed than the Naomi version. This will be the first time we've straight up gotten the Naomi release outside of the Arcade 1-Up cabinet as far as I know. I'm going to guess that they're probably going to enable every character from the start for this collection as well. The Naomi release notably had an experience system that unlocked characters that took way longer than reasonable to do, so I think having everyone available off the bat is a good call. The Punisher has a note about the ending in the Japanese versions being altered, and I have to imagine it involves the pictures used in the endings in that version, one of which depicts a homeless man, so it might have been in the interest of being sensitive to that issue. One change universal across all of the games is actually instantly noticeable in the trailer footage. The flashing lights the series employs during supers and such are gone, probably out of interest for those with epilepsy or sensitive to flashing lights and images. That said, they're not removed entirely, but on a toggle instead. You can toggle this on a per game basis, which is a thoughtful bit of customization. Speaking of thoughtfulness, another additional quality of life feature seems to be new single button special move controls, which is nice for anyone wanting to get into this who finds motion inputs daunting. The series has already had a history of incorporating easier controls. which, hey, I just so happened to cover that in the previous video if you want to learn more about that. So this seems like a logical extension of that. It is worth noting that these simplified controls won't be usable in ranked matches online though. As fantastic as this collection is looking to be, there are a few things probably worth mentioning that kinda suck a bit. The biggest one is that the game seems to be completely skipping Xbox platforms, only releasing on PS4, Switch, and Steam. Historically, Xbox versions of these games have always sold the lowest of the console versions, and that's been reflected in Capcom pretty much writing off the platform as far as these collections go, with the Battle Network compilation in particular skipping Xbox. And honestly, it's kind of a shame, since I know it's more than likely a business decision more than anything else, and the audience for the series is probably the lowest on that platform, but I think the series being made available to as many people as possible is important. This one's more of a personal thing, and I 100% understand why they wouldn't bother, and it's probably for the best that their time was spent elsewhere, but I think it would have been really neat if this had also included X-Men Mutant Apocalypse and Marvel Superheroes War of the Gems as playable titles. They're Capcom's other Marvel projects aside from MVC and Punisher, and while War of the Gems is just kinda okay, Mutant Apocalypse is pretty damn great, and with X-Men 97 hype being a thing these days, this collection would have been the perfect time to release it. And while I'm elated that we're in an age now where rollback netcode is becoming the standard for fighting games, as it should be, the website confirms that there won't be any crossplay, which does kind of sting a bit. Again, I feel like this might have a big enough casual appeal that there wouldn't be as much overlap between this collection and Fightcade like there was for the previous fighting collection. But I think a unified player base across all platforms would have been the healthiest thing for the game's longevity overall. I imagine the PS4 version will probably have the highest player base, since the Switch versions historically become wastelands before long, and I imagine most people playing on PC are probably savvy enough to get Fightcade working. I'm not tripping over most of that though. This is one hell of a gift horse, and like hell am I gonna look it in the mouth. It's so nice to be able to talk about this series now and not have to lament about how inaccessible it is. The collection seems to be in good hands, is getting a physical release that'll make it far easier to actually keep around, and more importantly, it opens the door for further endeavors. They're marketing this collection as part of the Fighting Collection series branding, which tells me there could be more down the line. Since Naomi emulation seems to be sorted out for this, that means that other Naomi-based games like Project Justice and both Power Stone games could be on the table thanks to running on the same hardware. And hey, you know what other Versus games run on Naomi? You know, the games against the company getting guest characters in Street Fighter 6? I don't think the chances of a Capcom vs SNK collection have been any higher than they are now. And I don't want to get anyone's hopes up here, this is just rampant and pie-in-the-sky fanboy speculation, but I just want to point out that every time an MVC game has gotten a high-profile re-release, a new entry was announced shortly thereafter. Marvel 3 was announced about a year after Marvel 2 HD dropped on PS3 and 360, and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 PS4 was famously announced alongside Infinite. Again, the chances of this leading to something are slim to none, but before today, I'd have told you those chances were zero. That's gotta count for something. That's going to do it for this video. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. We did it, guys. Marvel is freed.